In the gray dawn, the drizzle turned to fine rain as the coven members said their goodbyes, sending Penelope on her final journey. My mother-in-law had finally passed away from cancer. I used to love my mother-in-law. I saw her as a loving grandmother, a caring mother, and a staunch opponent of cribs. But when I learned of her meddling in my life, her evil curse, I cursed her. I cursed her, but it meant nothing because I had no power. Everything depended on my wife, her children, and her family. All I could do was forbid this evil from entering our home. That, in itself, was strange. Our house actually belonged to my wife's family, and my wife's mother had a right to it. I did not. But the house was enchanted, bewitched, alive with its own consciousness and personality. When I returned to my wife, the house, for lack of a better word, adopted me. It became very protective of me. And when I told my wife that her mother would no longer be welcome, the house refused to open its doors to Penelope. All her magic couldn't move the old house. I didn't like the house at first. It made me bang my head against the doorways, which seemed to get lower and lower until I couldn't bend down enough to enter the room unharmed. I banged my head until my wife threatened to have the house repaired. Then she left me alone. But over the years, he began to appreciate me and, according to my wife, he almost gave up hope when I left. Love is a strange thing. My wife and I have always had a connection, even as children. And although our 4 children were not genetically mine, my wife believes that my love for them, even when they were in her womb, created a bond with them that is precious and rare, even in which communities. Our bond brought me back after I fled in horror from my wife's betrayal, a betrayal forced upon her by the Tribunal of Families imposing marriage vows. The tribunal refused to continue our marriage unless Sarah, my wife, submitted to their Samhain breeding program. They went further and began threatening my life and well-being. My wife submitted, and when I learned of her infidelity, when I learned that my children were not mine, I ran away and did not show up for years. But our bond, my wife's bond, my children's bond, and my bond drew me home. I think it was even fostered by the house. But my mother-in-law's spells caused my wife to unknowingly have an abortion, and Penelope finally cursed her to never get pregnant by me again. According to my wife, she did it to protect us from the tribunal, but I have never been able to forgive her. Now, I stand behind the back of the coven as my wife's mother is lowered into her grave. I was here for Sarah, who loved her mother no matter what. The coven held a ceremony attended by over 100 witches, including 5 members of the tribunal. Alatar, the president of the tribunal, approached my wife after the ceremony to offer his condolences. My wife's eyes flashed with hatred for this man who had interfered in our lives, but she calmly accepted his words, which seemed shallow to me. Then he smiled at my wife and said, "Of course, you will now return to the Samhain ceremonies." My wife looked up in horror as I stepped forward. "No, she won't. She will no longer be your..." I shouted at the sorcerer. The crowd turned toward us. "Do not attempt to defy me, commoner." Alatar smiled, looking at my outstretched hand. I felt my index finger begin to point upward without my permission. Then it continued to curve upward, returning to my wrist. I grabbed it with my other hand, but I couldn't stop it from moving backward. "Stop, my son," Blaze shouted, jumping between me and the sorcerer. But before I could hear the cracking and screaming, I fell to the ground, clutching my broken finger. "Are you challenging me too?" Alatar shouted, and Blaze screamed, grabbing his head and falling to the ground beside me. My wife and daughters rushed to his and my aid as the sorcerer turned to Sarah again. "You will attend the Samhain celebration, or your family will return here for another funeral." He turned and walked away, followed by the other 4 members of the tribunal. The rest of the witches, including Sarah's 9 aunts, drifted away into the gray gloom, leaving my family alone at the grave. Sarah watched me as I cried out in pain over my broken finger, even as I tried to help Blaze. He was still clutching his head, but the pain seemed to be lessening. My misery resumed with every movement I made. Sarah looked me in the eye and said, "May I?" She was no longer trying to control my mind or even influence my emotions. She knew I thought it was evil and still resented her for interfering with my thoughts. But now I just nodded silently. "Please," came out of my mouth in the form of a groan. Sarah's gaze intensified, and suddenly, my pain was gone. She gently took my hand and set my finger back in place, righting the bone. With her other hand, she told me to press my index finger against my middle finger until she could tape them together. Then, she helped a stunned but recovered Blaze to his feet, and we left the cemetery. When we got home, the house felt our pain, locked all the doors and closed all the windows. We were in fortress mode. My wife was crying as she taped my fingers together. "I can't do this anymore. I won't do this anymore," she cried in pain. "But how can I protect you?" she cried. I asked Blaze what had happened to him. "Dad, it's like my brain has shrunk. Or rather, not my brain but my consciousness, my thoughts, my power. I felt like they were being crushed. I don't think I would have survived it if Alatar hadn't stopped in time." I saw my daughters flinch at my brother's words. "Well," I said, "I don't want any of you children involved in a confrontation with the tribunal, especially Alatar. If any of you get hurt, it will kill both your mother and me." They all protested, but my wife and I calmed them down and sent them to bed. Nothing was going to happen or be decided that night. Sarah and I also went to bed and made love tenderly, the sadness and anxiety giving the act a strange coloring. We made love many more times after my return, though the thought lingered in my mind that, because of her mother's curse, the act itself was fruitless. I loved my wife and felt her sadness at not being able to conceive a child. I knew she felt my pain too. As Samhain approached, my family became increasingly quiet and did not leave the house. It was as if we were afraid to leave, hoping that the building would somehow protect us. We remained steadfast in our determination to defy the tribunal. I told my wife that I loved her, but that I would rather die than let her submit to their brutality again. She spent time with our children, studying spells and curses, hoping to find some defense. In the end, she failed. That Halloween, we stayed in our locked house, with a dark porch light and no decorations. My wife and I spent the night in each other's arms, making love one last time before the tribunal began its work. They didn't come on All Saints' Day to deal with our disobedience. They waited until All Souls' Day. Alatar stood in front of the other four, who lined up behind him, facing our front door. I told Sarah I wouldn't hide in the house. Dom refused to open the door at first, until I asked if he expected me to be a coward. "Is that what you think of me? Besides, I knew the tribunal would attack the house if I hid inside, and I didn't want the old man to get hurt because of me. I seemed to love this house." The door opened reluctantly. My wife and I stepped out onto the porch and faced Alatar, who asked mockingly, "So, did the condemned come to the execution voluntarily?" "Car, carry on," I shouted. Not the most famous last words. But what the hell? I'm a simple man. Alatar raised his hands, as did his friends, and I, like Blaze, felt my brain clench. The pain was incredible. My eyes popped out from under my eyelids, and I stared in fear at the attacking wizards. Out of the red mist that filled my vision, I suddenly saw the red lines connecting the tribunal to Alatar, and I saw the thread with which he had attacked me. Before the tribunal could cast its killing spell, my children ran outside and lined up next to me and their mother. "Get back inside." I screamed in pain, but I saw that Blaze and his sisters weren't listening to me. Their eyes were fixed on Alatar. A look of surprise appeared on the sorcerer's face, and my mind partially released. I saw Alatar's expression change to anger as he focused, calling to his comrades. The red lines of communication grew darker and darker, coming from the tribunal members and down to Alatar. Then he reached out with bright red lines to my children and wife. They screamed just as they had then in the cemetery. "Blaze!" My breath caught. My heart threatened to burst from the fear that gripped me at the sight of my family's suffering. I began to see our bond materialize, lines similar to the one Alatar had with his coven. An orange line stretched from each of my suffering children to me, and from my wife to me. I felt a sense of power and tried to harness that connection. I directed my anger at Alatar. With surprise, he staggered, and the red lines disappeared. He looked at me in shock, and I directed a pulse of energy at him. He staggered again but then focused on me, and I felt the wave of disabling pain clench my mind again. I relied even more on my family's power. The orange lines grew brighter and brighter, but I could feel Alatar trying to crush my soul. Everything around me began to darken. I tried to resist, but I felt my will being crushed. Suddenly, a new connection joined me. This new connection was stronger than the connection I had with any of my children. It was even stronger than the one I had with Sarah. I saw it in the form of a thick, bright orange line. I felt the fist clenching my mind pull back. I began to direct pulse after pulse at Alatar and saw my orange line encompass him and pass by him to the rest of the tribunal, our orange color defeating the red bonds of the tribunal. The bond with my wife and children was restored when Alatar's attack on them was destroyed, and the new bond one had established seemed to grow stronger as well. The orange lines grew brighter and more luminous, and the tribunal members screamed and fell to the ground, grabbing their heads. I continued to push them as hard as I could, throwing out pulse after pulse. I don't know how I did it. I was just letting my hatred for these people out. I felt my wife grab my hand and heard her say, "Stop, you have to stop." I looked at my wife, and fatigue came over me. Weakly, I walked over to the porch swing and fell onto it. My wife rushed to the aid of the men lying on the ground. She helped them up when the pain eased, as she had done with Blaze in the cemetery. Alatar roughly pushed my wife away, cursing her, and rose to his feet. He focused on me, and I braced myself for his surprise attack. But it didn't happen. A look of confusion froze on his face. He focused again and again, but he couldn't hurt me. "It's all gone," he wailed. "It's all gone, my power. It's gone." That proved true for the entire tribunal. Their power had been burned out of their minds. I walked up to the porch and looked at them. I laughed as I watched Alatar and his friends flee in fear. I hugged my wife. I asked what happened. How did I do that? My wife looked pensive, trying to understand what had happened. "I've heard of people passing on witchcraft in the past. That's what happens when there's a higher power." What kind of power?" I asked. She laughed. "I always thought it was a trivial tale, but they say it's the greatest power in the universe." She reached up and kissed me. Love. Love is the strongest force in all of nature." I leaned back on the swing, pulling my wife into my lap.
I smilte her.
"Your mother's curse ended when she died, didn't it?" Her head lifted from my chest in surprise. She looked me in the eyes and said, "Maybe. It depends on how she phrased the curse." She shook her head. "Why do you think it ended?" I lifted Sarah into my arms. "Because, my love, you're pregnant." I told her about the new connection that tipped the scales in our favor. I told her that I saw power lines between all the players that day. Then I told her that I saw a power line come out of her belly. "That's our daughter." I laughed with joy. Sarah hugged me tightly and cried. Epilogue. After the destruction of the Hexing Family Tribunal, Sarah was asked to lead the new tribunal, recognizing the strength our family had shown in defeating Alatar and his coven. The new tribunal was formed with the participation of her children. She offered me a seat, but I declined. My family discontinued the breeding program, though the Samhain ceremonies continued, on a voluntary basis. Witches just love a good party.